Hello and welcome, friend. I'm Thorn the Skald, a master of history plundering the past one raid at a time. Our last category of source material is saga literature. If you're not familiar with sagas already, they're basically the medieval Norse equivalent to today's historical fiction. But that's not to say that they're purely fiction. On the contrary, saga literature is essentially a blend between recounting genuine history, as it was remembered, and readapting it for the needs of the present. So it's both true, yet not so true. But don't worry, we'll talk about that issue a bit more in a later lecture. Nevertheless, most saga literature isn't actually about Norse mythology or heroic legends at all. So why bother? Well, because many sagas do actually contain fragments of Norse lore. Sure, we may not have a whole cake, but sprinkles are still pretty sweet. That said, we have three genres of saga literature to consider, beginning with the most relevant to, perhaps, the least relevant. I'll do this briefly though, since we'll be discussing each of these genres with more detail in later lectures. Sagas about ancient times. You can probably guess why these sagas would be the most relevant to a lecture about Norse mythology. Even though most of them were written in the 13th and 14th centuries, sagas in this genre are typically set in a heroic past, hence the ancient times bit. We've actually already covered this heroic past in lecture 1.3. Indeed, these sagas often take place between the years 400 and 550 CE, long before the Viking Age, when powerful warlords reshaped the Norse world from the ashes of catastrophe. There are roughly 25 of these sagas, but the most famous is undoubtedly the Saga of the Volsungs. Here's a sample. The old man said, "This horse is descended from Sleipnir. He should be brought up well, because he will be a better horse than any other." Then the man disappeared. Sigurd named the horse Grani, and he was indeed the best of all horses. The old man he had met was Odin. Sagas about kings. These sagas are mostly helpful for learning about Norse mythology because of all the skaldic poetry they contain, rather than for the narratives themselves. Most of them come from three manuscripts written and compiled in the 13th century, but the most well-known is probably Heimskringla, which was supposedly written by none other than Snorri Sturluson. It contains several saga biographies about Norwegian kings, but the most relevant to our discussion would be the Saga of the Inglings. In that saga, the gods are main characters, but distorted once again by euhemerism, yet still not as viciously as Saxo's treatment. Here's a sample. To the east of Tanakvisl in Asia, it was called Asaland, the land of the Aesir, or Asaheimir, the world of the Aesir. And the capital city that was in that land they called Asgard. And in that town was a ruler who was called Odin. Odin was a great warrior and very widely traveled, and took power over many countries. He was so blessed with victory that in every battle he was the winner, and it came about that his people believed that he was able to assign victory in every battle. Finally, we have my personal favorite, the 40 or so sagas about Icelanders written in the 13th and 14th centuries, but sometimes even later. While they hardly have anything to do with Norse mythology, favoring instead the realistic feuds between Icelandic farmers in the Viking Age, they occasionally include brief cameos of Norse gods and goddesses, especially if it's Thor. He appears in 12 of these sagas, compared to Odin, who only comes up in 5. Even so, these references are typically insignificant, save for a few exceptions where gods actually play an active role in the saga. Here's an example of that from Bard's saga. There was a man named Grim who pulled in fish mightily, and he was described as red-bearded. The man the saga follows here is named Ingjald, and he stays with Grim as the weather worsens. Grim says he must stay put until he has filled the boat. This doesn't go well. Ingjald is saved by Bard, but Grim had disappeared on the boat when Bard arrived. As a result, it was thought by people that it must have been Thor. This has been a long lecture, so perhaps you're thinking I lied when I said we had a scanty body of surviving sources for Norse mythology. Depending on how you look at it, you might not actually be wrong for thinking that way. After all, it would take a single person a long time to read all of the sources we've discussed so far. Most wouldn't even be able to do so over the course of several years of studies. I certainly haven't. You'd have to read over 100 sagas, and that's not even including Snorri's Edda, Saxo's Gesta Danorum, and all of the poetic material. But here's the thing. All of that material comes from later medieval manuscripts, and we're trying to understand a once-living religion from the Viking Age. No matter how you look at it, all of that evidence amounts to a mere summary of what once was. What's worse is that each of those sources had different motives behind their production to begin with. They weren't all written for the sake of Norse mythology. Instead, they were written to provide entertainment, praise kings, create poetry, provide moral education, and serve as source material for later storytelling. We are indeed left with fragments, remnants from the void that once was a living mythos. There is no Bible for Norse mythology, and there never was. Norse paganism wasn't a monolith, but rather a fluid worldview that changed over time and varied from place to place. Some of our sources suggest that even a single story could have had several different versions, depending when and where one was in the Norse world. Beyond our fragments, we can only imagine how much variety there once was. But alas, we must work with what little we have, and that requires constant vigilance. Every source obscures our view of Norse mythology for two main reasons: time and purpose. In other words, each source relies on a potentially flawed memory of the past that is reshaped for the needs of their present. Even when we use these sources to give context to material evidence from the Viking Age itself, such as runestones, we're still basing our understanding on summaries provided by later authors. As a result, the version of Norse mythology you're about to learn from the remainder of this module isn't the Norse mythology of the Viking Age. It may be close, and it may contain fragments of truth, but it's like putting together a glass after it's broken. The view is never quite the same. And yet, that doesn't mean that we have nothing to look through. We may have a void, but we do have some fragments, so let's see what we can make out of them.